Okay, somebody remind me, please, when we get towards the end of the period, say 10 minutes left, I got to show you a couple of videos that are important before we leave today. Okay, today's subtopic is going to be the Kennedy administration and civil rights, and we're going to tell you some things that the Kennedy administration did concerning civil rights. And as we mentioned yesterday, he did not have a lot of time because of his assassination to do what he wanted to do. But during his presidential administration, which had to be early in his administration, he did three things to improve the civil rights issue in America. Okay? So President Kennedy, early in his presidential administration, did three things to improve the civil rights issue. Okay, the first thing he did is he established, and it's on your ID sheet, the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. Established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, better known as CEEO. So President Kennedy established the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, also known, or better known maybe as the CEEO. Now, does anybody want to take a guess of what the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity did? He established it. What did it do? I mean, you can look at it and almost guess, but it had a little bit of a twist to it. So obviously the committee is going to make sure that all people have equal employment opportunity, especially who? Blacks. But what could they do to ensure that? How could they ensure that every person, no matter their race, had an equal opportunity of employment? What is the thing they had control of that they could say that you need to do this? Could they control every restaurant, every hotel, those types of things in the country? What could they control to make sure that every person, no matter their race, had an equal opportunity of employment? What could they control? What could the government control? Close. Businesses or companies that what? Worked for the federal government. So what the CEEO did is it ensured that all businesses and companies that work for the federal government. Can you imagine how many that really would be? Here's a company that works for the federal government right here. What's this company? Public education. Okay? So any business or company that worked for the federal government had to give every person, no matter their race, an equal opportunity for employment. So if you used the school, for example, you could not discriminate against anyone when you hired them to be a teacher, a teacher's aide, or a cook, or whatever those types of things were. So the CEEO, for the first time in history, ensured that businesses or companies that work for the federal government gave every person, no matter their race, an equal opportunity for employment. Okay? That's the first thing he did. The second thing the Kennedy administration did concerning civil rights to improve the issue is he directed his brother Robert Kennedy at the Justice Department to support the efforts of blacks to vote, especially in the Deep South. Okay? The president directed his brother, Robert Kennedy, at the Justice Department to support the efforts of blacks to vote, especially in the Deep South. He directed Robert Kennedy at the Justice Department to support the efforts of blacks to vote, especially in the Deep South. Why would we need to do that? Why would we need to support efforts of blacks to vote in the Deep South? They have the right to vote, don't they? All you have to do is a certain age, doesn't matter what race you are.
There was difficulties with the people, they would hurt them or try to discourage them from voting.
That's exactly right. At this time in American history, although blacks had the ability to vote, very few took their right to vote or exercised their right to vote because of the repercussions and violence that occurred when they went to the polls. And we'll talk more about this later. So what John Kennedy wanted to do is he wanted his brother in the Justice Department, the Attorney General, to make sure that he sat down and helped blacks go to the polls without fear of repercussion or violence. Because that was happening. They were being very discouraged to vote by people that were prejudiced. Okay? The third thing Kennedy did is he made key appointments in his administration to African Americans. He gave people within his administration jobs that were African Americans. I'm going to give you 3 examples of who that would be. that you may or may not have heard of. I'm sure you've heard of one. The first example was he named Carl T. Rowan U.S. Ambassador to Finland. He named Carl T. Rowan U.S. Ambassador to Finland. That was pretty cool last year when I said that when Saskia, you know, she was from Finland, so she thought, well, that's kind of neat. And here's Carl T. Rowan, if you he's up at the top up there. He was ambassador to Finland. Okay, so one of the key appointments Kennedy made in his administration is he appointed African-American Carl T. Rowan as U.S. ambassador to Finland. He also gave Pierre Sal, he gave him an associate or assistant press secretary, and that turned out to be Andrew Hacker. So the president appointed Andrew Hacker as associate or assistant press secretary under the supervision of Pierre Salinger. He appointed Andrew Hacker as associate press secretary under the supervision of Pierre Salinger. And the third appointment, you might have heard of this person. President Kennedy appointed Thurgood Marshall to serve as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals. President Kennedy appointed Thurgood Marshall to serve as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals. Who's Thurgood Marshall? What's he best known for? Anybody know? Well, we are in trouble. Very good. He was the first African-American ever to be named Supreme Court Justice. So he worked his way up the ranks, but who gave him his start, his break? President Kennedy, when he named him as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals. So those are some things that President Kennedy did to make civil rights have some improvements. Unfortunately, our next subtopics, which is entitled Early Struggles in the Civil Rights Movement, is going to tell you about 7 major events that happened in the United States during the Kennedy presidency that really gave the country a black eye concerning civil rights. So although he tried very hard early in his presidency to do some things that would improve the issue, I'm going to give you 7 examples under the subtopic Early Struggles in the Civil Rights Movement of things that happened in the United States concerning civil rights during the Kennedy presidency that really gave the United States a black eye. Okay? And we'll do them in order and kind of give you some explanation. The first event, number 1, happened in 1961, and it was entitled The Freedom Riders. And these are on your ID sheet kind of in order so you kind of get an idea of where the identifications go after that. So event number 1 occurred in 1961, and it involved a group known as the Freedom Riders. And again, that's on your ID sheet to kind of let you have a help with that. Anybody know what the Freedom Riders were?
They rode on the buses from place to place. Well,
they did that, and they did more than that, but what were they? Who made up what we know as the Freedom Riders?
College kids.
Okay, well, we're getting a little too, that's correct, but a little bit too specific. What type of people were, and white. They were both black and white people who were members of the Civil Rights Movement. I want to make sure, because a lot of people think that the Civil Rights Movement was made up just of black people. There were a lot of people, black and white, that joined the Civil Rights Movement. And Alex is exactly right. A lot of these people were college students. A lot of them were. Not all, but a lot of them were. And Brianna's right, because they did ride buses, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about. Well, in 1961, the Freedom Riders set out for the Deep South to protest and defy those Jim Crow laws we were talking about, asking for change. So in 1961, the Freedom Riders, again, black and white members of the Civil Rights Movement, Freedom Riders, set out for the Deep South in protest, and they were going to protest and defy Jim Crow laws, asking for change. They wanted people not to discriminate at drinking fountains, not to discriminate in restaurants, not to discriminate in hotels, not to discriminate on city buses. They didn't like those Jim Crow laws. And so they decided to set out for the Deep South to protest and defy those, wanting change. Now, the first example of this peaceful protest was when a group of Freedom Riders traveled in Greyhound buses from Birmingham, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. So this first example that we're talking about a peaceful protest when a group of freedom riders decided to travel in Greyhound buses from Birmingham, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. You know what Greyhound buses are? You guys are kind of, not a lot of people take them anymore, but they still have them. They're buses that stop and give people rides to different places. They're not near as popular now as they were in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But you see Greyhound bus stations every once in a while. There's one in Billings. I don't know if there's one in Casper. I don't go to Casper that much. But anyway, they travel in Greyhound buses from Birmingham, Alabama to Montgomery. Now, the idea behind this is they were going to go down to Montgomery and protest segregation in bus stations. That was their plan, to go down to Montgomery and protest segregation in bus stations. What's segregation in bus stations? Whites bathroom only, okay? Whites drinking fountain only, blacks come in the back, those types of things. So they were going down to Montgomery, Alabama to protest segregation in bus stations. That was their plan. So obviously they were going to take a Greyhound bus from Birmingham, travel together down to Montgomery, and then do a peaceful protest outside the bus station there in Montgomery. That was the plan. Well, when the Freedom Riders got in Birmingham to board the buses, before they even left, they were beaten and harassed. So before they even got on the buses, or while they were trying to get on the buses in Birmingham, racists, white racists, beat them and harassed them. So when the Freedom Riders arrived in Birmingham to board the Greyhound buses to Montgomery, they were beaten and harassed before they ever got on the buses. And even though they suffered injuries, even though there was violence against them, the Freedom Riders were determined to carry on their protest to Montgomery, but there became an issue. Okay, so picture that. They're trying to get on the buses, they're getting beaten and harassed. Despite that, they get on the buses and they're ready to go, but what's the problem? What? What about him? He couldn't find a bus driver. Who would want to take that task on, right? So the problem was that no bus driver that was employed by the Greyhound Bus Company wanted to take the risk or responsibility to drive that bus or those buses from Birmingham to Montgomery. Would you want that task? That'd be a tough duty. Now, this is public transportation. You pay for it. So does Greyhound have a legal responsibility to provide a bus driver for paying customers? They certainly do. So providing that driver was required by law. Passengers had a right to public transportation if they paid for it. So who had to get involved to solve the issue? No?
State troopers.
Higher than that. Higher than that. Lower than that. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had to get involved at the Justice Department. So to solve the issue, Attorney General Robert Kennedy got involved. And basically what he did is he called the Greyhound Bus Company personally and demanded that they would provide drivers for the Freedom Riders. That's your responsibility by law. You, by God, will do it. And the head of Greyhound figured it out. And what did he do? He sent drivers to take them down. Okay? So, Robert Kennedy gets involved. He makes it really clear through the Attorney General's office that Greyhound has a legal responsibility to provide drivers for these people. It's public transportation. They paid for it. Finally, the leaders of Greyhound agree and drivers. Now, Kennedy was nervous about what was going to happen in Montgomery, so he sent his own aide, his own member of the Justice Department, John Siegenthaler, to Montgomery to report directly back to him the events there. So Robert Kennedy directed John Siegenthaler, member of his Justice Department, to travel to Montgomery to observe the Freedom Riders' arrival there and to report back directly to his office in Washington, D.C. what was going on. And here's a picture of John Siegenthaler right here, behind the old American flag here. Well, he's not obviously riding on the bus, right? He's going to drive in his own car there and report back, because even in those days they had communication devices. They didn't call them cell phones, in which he could report back to the White House or to the Justice Department. Well, when the bus arrived in Montgomery, the Freedom Riders were greeted by a large mob as they got off the bus. They were immediately assaulted. They were beaten with baseball bats, crude clubs, pushed, kicked, punched, horribly treated. Beaten up, basically. So again, when the bus arrived in Montgomery, the Freedom Riders were greeted by a large mob as they got off the bus. They were immediately assaulted and beaten with baseball bats and crude clubs. They were pushed, kicked, punched. And all of this happened as local police officers and FBI agents stood and watched. So these Freedom Riders were beaten with baseball bats, crude clubs, kicked, pushed, punched, and all this violence against this peaceful protest occurred as local police officers and FBI agents looked on doing nothing. So getting back to old John Siegenthaler, he's reporting this back to Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and all of a sudden he sees this going on, and he sees that they're not getting any support. So Siegenthaler himself gets out to try to get things under control a little bit, and he's pushed to the ground, and they beat the hell out of him too. So he becomes one of the victims of the beatings in Montgomery. So Siegenthaler's in his car reporting directly back to Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy's listening on this special phone. Siegenthaler decides to get out and see if he can provide some assistance to get this thing under control. He's pushed to the ground, beaten, gets beaten. They beat the hell out of him just as well, just like all the others. Well, Robert Kennedy is hearing this live on this special telephone that Siegenthaler has. He's hearing the whole thing. And he is furious. And who's the first call he makes? Who gets the first chewing? FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover gets a phone call from the Attorney General, who asked him for an explanation of why FBI agents would stand and watch such an event without lifting a finger. So Robert Kennedy immediately calls J. Edgar Hoover, who's also up on the board up here, J. Edgar Hoover, asking for an explanation of why FBI agents would stand and do nothing while members of the Freedom of his Justice Department were beaten unmercifully. So there's event number one that happened during the Kennedy administration that gave the United States a black eye concerning civil rights. Okay, event number two, we talked a little bit about before, but not a lot. Happened in 1962 at the University of Mississippi. Anybody remember what happened there from our previous lecture on At a Glance? Yep, James Meredith, a veteran of the Air Force, had left what college? Anybody remember? Jackson State. And he decided that he wanted to go to the University of Mississippi, and he was denied admission. Remember, we talked about that just briefly before. Well, this occurred on September 20th, 1962. September 20th, 1962, James Meredith, a black military veteran, was denied admission at the University of Mississippi. September 20th, 1962, James Meredith, a black military veteran, was denied admission at the University of Mississippi. And I think I told you some of this, or maybe I didn't. Maybe I didn't tell you this. He joined the Air Force immediately after high school, and he served his country from 1951 to 1960. So James Meredith joined the Air Force immediately after high school and served his country from 1951 to 1960. And as I mentioned, after he was discharged and served his country, he attended Jackson State College for 2 years. That was an all-black college, which now is Jackson State University. It's much bigger, and it's not segregated, although most kids that go there are black. But he went to Jackson State College for for 2 years after he was discharged from the Air Force, and he wanted to continue his studies at the University of Mississippi. Well, as he attempted to register for classes at Ole Miss, that's what they call it, Ole Miss, he was personally prevented from registering by Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. Ross Barnett personally prevented him from registering for classes at the University of Mississippi. The governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, personally made sure that James Meredith could not register for classes because he was black. Well, word got back to the president, as you can imagine, and President Kennedy personally called Governor Barnett, personally called him, and ordered him to allow Meredith to register at the university. So when President Kennedy gets word that James Meredith, an Air Force veteran, is denied admission at the University of Mississippi, the president personally calls Governor Barnett and orders him to allow his enrollment. Well, you don't have much choice. The President of the United States calls and tells you to do something, so he did it. And unfortunately, the enrollment of James Meredith led to violence, including big-time rioting on campus. So when Barnett gave in and allowed James Meredith to enroll at the University of Mississippi, what resulted is violent rioting on campus. It was so bad that President Kennedy had to send in 5,000 National Guard troops to restore order on that college campus. It got so bad that President Kennedy was forced to send in 5,000 National Guard troops to restore order on campus. Over one black veteran, Air Force veteran,